I'm Robert Joseph Cangelosi, MD. I'm a physician ophthalmologist. Born here in New Orleans 88 years ago. My grandparents, all four Sicilians, came from the town of Cefalù. The Cangelosi grandparents and the Greco grandparents. We all lived on Royal Street. The Cangelosi grandparents lived at 934 Royal, a house where General Beauregard lived for 10 years. They grew up there. I remember many, many Sundays there. My other grandparents lived at 1312 Royal. Remember many dinners there. I lived between the two houses on Royal and Barracks at 1236 Royal. I grew up in the quarter. I went to grammar school across the street from the Beauregard-Keyes home at St. Mary's Italian. Graduated there in 1942. I can remember this house even when it was empty. Sometimes as the altar boy used to come play in the patio here because it was vacant and empty at the time. St. Mary's Italian Church across the street, I was an altar boy. And it was amazing because masses on Sunday, one mass at St. Mary's, the sermon was always in Italian because all the parishioners were Italians. 2 blocks up the street, St. Louis Cathedral, same time Mass on Sunday was in French. And that was part of growing up in New Orleans. The city of New Orleans was really a Sicilian French quarter at that time. On Sundays, both grandparents had dinners. The Cangelosi grandparents had a dinner one Sunday, and the following Sunday, the Greco grandparents had a dinner. Meals were pretty similar. Sunday consisted of appetizer of spaghetti, not sauce, but gravy, meatballs, and daube. Daube is meat that's soaked in the gravy. That was an appetizer. After that, we always had fried chicken, salad, vegetables, and always a big dessert. Always, both grandparents had the same thing. That was always on Sunday. Cangelosi grandparents, we were 3 boys in my family. My uncle had 3 girls, lived in the same house, 934 Royal. After dinner, they would send us to the movie house 2 blocks up. There was a movie theater called the Gaiety on Royal and Ursuline Street. Nickname for it was the Garlic, because all the Italians used to bring lunch, and all the sandwiches always had garlic, so the movie theater kind of smelled like the garlic. When you grew up in the quarter in those days, you never had to leave the quarter. We had pharmacy, groceries. I can remember walking to the Decatur Street for my mother to buy chicken. Now, no dead chickens or frozen chickens, all live chickens. You pick out the chicken, they cut the head off, take the feathers out, and you go home with the fresh chicken. For other foods, French Market always had fresh meat. They would cut it for you right there, and the fish was always fresh. Living on Royal Street, there was a streetcar, the Desire streetcar. Used to ride up Royal Street and down Bourbon. So when I wanted to go to Canal Street for shopping or for a movie house, the only places in town in those days that were air-conditioned, you caught the Desire streetcar. For 7 cents, you went up to the Canal Street. You also got a transfer. So if you went up with your 7 cents, spent some time on Canal Street, you used the transfer to come down on the Franklin streetcar on the same track, going down. So 7 cents to go to Canal Street and come back. So the quarter was a unique place. Everybody was friendly. We really didn't have integration either. I grew up with African-American family down the block. I shined shoes with African-American young boys. Everybody got along well. It was a great time, and at that time, the quarter was all families. There are actually no hotels or motels in the quarter. Things have changed now. The quarter has lost its integrity of being family-oriented. There are not too many families left. There's some, but not many. But in the days that I grew up, it was all families. For a while, I lived on 1412 Royal, which is basement house just above Esplanade. My grandfather had built it. During Prohibition, my dad had a physician friend who loved wine, and of course you couldn't buy wine. So he had these huge oaken casks made that were put in the basement, and he brewed his own wines. My father was a pharmacist. He had a pharmacy here in the quarter, and he would get grain alcohol and put different spirits in it to flavor it and sell it as brandy, only to friends, of course, because it was illegal to sell any kind of liquor in those days. As a pharmacist, my father sold alcohol on prescriptions. In those days, during Prohibition, the government printed out beautiful manuscripts of permits, and it would say dispense spiritus fermenti, which is alcohol, 1 pint. Sometimes it said 1 pint of 4 roses, and the directions were 1 tablespoon with meals. So that was one way of getting alcohol during the time of Prohibition. St. Mary's Italian, where I grew up, we were baptized there. Usually you were married there. I can remember one time as an altar boy serving Mass with the priest, and somebody came in, interrupted the priest to notify everybody in church that this was during World War II, that Germany had surrendered. America had taken over Italy, and all the parishioners were so happy that Italy was now not Nazis anymore, but part of the Allies. So great, great memories here in New Orleans. All the Italians had St. Joseph altars for St. Joseph and Thanksgiving for favors received. And you can walk in 1 block down the quarter and see at least 3 to 4 St. Joseph altars in 1 block. And it was just great, great times. Everybody was friendly. The boys, the girls, everybody grew up together. I went to school across the street, St. Mary's Italian School. It was small enrollment. In fact, the address is 1112 Charter Street, and it makes it easy to remember. When I graduated, we were 11 boys and 12 girls, and all Italians. They had a mother's club. All the ladies were Italian. They did everything together. My dad lived at 934 Royal, where I mentioned General Beauregard lived for 10 years. One day, he and his brother crawled out of the bedroom on the 3rd floor into the roof through the dormer. This was the night that the great French Opera House caught fire and burned. So they watched the Opera House burn the night. That was really a great loss to the city of New Orleans. After grammar school, I went to high school, St. Aloysius, which was right on the edge of the quarter. So I used to walk to school. All my life until I finally, even when I was married, I lived here for a while. But my whole life was spent in the quarter. And it was just a great experience. You could do everything you wanted in the quarter and never had to leave. Everything you wanted was here. Some of the at the French Opera House, I remember my dad telling me the story. One of his greatest nights at the French Opera House, he went to listen to Enrico Caruso sing here in New Orleans. And that was a highlight of my dad. My grandfather had a grocery store. He had a wholesale produce. It was on Decatur Street. It was a 4-story building. He had a banana plantation in Panama, and he sold, he had 2 boats. He sold bananas. He used to get them from Panama. And he sold wholesale produce all through the state of Louisiana. My other grandparent, the Greco, my mother's father, also was a grocer. He had a grocery store, just a domestic grocery store on Decatur and Barracks. They were just 4 blocks apart. And I can remember as a kid working in my grandfather's grocery on Decatur and Barracks. In those days, the river was full of ships and stevedores. And at lunchtime, the stevedores would be hungry and come looking for food. And my grandfather was all set at 12 o'clock. In the summertime, I'd help him. He had all the different meats out, all the bread, French bread, Italian twist bread, to make sandwiches. and I would help. He would take the bread, cut the meat, I'd put the mayonnaise on and wrap them up. Everybody would buy their sandwich. They would get their soft drink. Here in New Orleans at the time, one of the big soft drinks was called Dr. Nut. It was made here in New Orleans. It was a great concoction that everybody enjoyed. So I spent many a summer in the grocery store making groceries. My grandfather had a sort of a credit, and he didn't keep books. He knew how to work his adding machine. Somebody would come in, they'd buy groceries, he'd put everything on the ticket. And if you came in, everything that you bought was put under the tomato paste. Your neighbor came in, bought some stuff, it was run up on the ticket, and that was put under the grape juice. Every time you came in, your tickets were put together. At the end of the month, you came in, you totaled them up, and you paid. All on credit. Everybody who charged always paid. So it was part of being family and part of being Italian, and well, not Italian, but Sicilian. At the turn of the century, there were two big ports of embarkation in the United States. There was one in New York and one in New Orleans. Now, through the port of embarkation in New York came all the Italians. Through the port of embarkation in New Orleans came all the Sicilians. Everybody knows the Brooklyn accent, and it's because at the port of embarkation in New York, the Germans, the Italians, the Spaniards, and the big mixture came out. The American that came out was this Brooklyn accent. People think New Orleans is a Southern accent. New Orleans is no Southern accent at all. In fact, most people say we have a Brooklyn accent. And the reason being, it's the same mix of people who came to the city of New Orleans, just like the city of New York. So we have that same type of accent. And when I grew up, a lot of people don't realize, New Orleans was a great cosmopolitan city. With the Catholic Church, they claim the oldest diocese in New Orleans is in Baltimore. New Orleans was second. But New Orleans was a Catholic diocese before Baltimore. But it was the Diocese of Havana. We were under Cuba, we were Spanish rule at the time. So even though we're older than the Diocese of Baltimore, we're not the oldest American diocese because we were the Diocese of Havana. The history. I've had Northerners come down, kind of think, well, you know, down there, y'all kind of backwards and not really cultured. And I will ask them, where are you from? New York? Yes. Tell me, where's the first opera ever performed in the United States? Says, oh, of course, New York. No, it was New Orleans. First opera ever performed in the continental United States. It was in French, but it was here in the city of New Orleans. And the culture goes way back because the French who founded it, and then with the Great Fire, most of the French town burned down. One of the few buildings to survive that fire was across the street from where we are now, the old French Opera House, the old French, the Ursuline Convent. One of the stories is that the miraculous statue, the one that helped win the Battle of New Orleans against the British, as the fire was approaching the convent across the street, the nuns put the statue in the window and the fire stopped just before that building burned down. So, and the old French, the building across the street is actually the oldest building in the Mississippi Valley. And it's just a beautiful thing. When we used to have Mass at St. Mary's on a Sunday, after Mass, everybody would walk around the corner, past the Beauregard house, go to Angelo Bacata's. Angelo Bacata was an ice cream parlor. It had confection called cannoli, a hard cone stuffed with cream and different types of Italian ice cream. The town that my grandparents from Sicily, was a little town called Cefalù, which is on the northern coast. And a lot of the Sicilians in New Orleans were from Cefalù. And way back, my dad, I think, was one of the original members. They founded the Cefalutana Society. And I'm a member of that still. We still have meetings and have Mass once a year. And we have get-togethers. But they even, when we had a special Mass, for Christ, the patron of Cefalù. The Mass was at St. Mary's Italian across the street, and we had a band. It was a trumpet, a clarinet, and a big bass drum. And they'd play these Italian songs, and after Mass, band would proceed down the street, around the corner. Everybody would follow, and we'd wind up at Angelo Baccatta's ice cream parlor. The Gaiety Theater, which I mentioned, when we used to go to the Gaiety, this was in the 30s, on a Sunday, they would give me 30 cents. It was 3 boys and 3 girls, and we went to the movie house, a nickel apiece in those days. You bought candy, it was 2 cents for some candy. But you had it was a great babysitter. For your nickel, you got a movie, a symphonette, a serial, a comedy, and a cartoon. So you went in at 1 o'clock, you probably didn't get back home until 5 or 6 o'clock. So it was a great way to spend a Sunday. Riding the streetcar, when I lived on Royal Street, the streetcar passed in front of the house all night long. When they stopped the streetcars, I couldn't sleep at night. I missed the sound, the noise of the streetcar. It was too quiet to sleep. Funny thing, but it was true. That's what happened. At St. Mary's, I would come across the street to the Beauregard house at the time. It was empty. We'd play in the yard, play in through the house. There used to be some homeless people here sometimes when the house was empty. And it was really falling apart at the time, but the yard was a lot of fun. My dad grew up on 934 Royal. He was the youngest of 5 boys. My grandfather had 5 boys, 5 girls. My grandfather did fairly well. He had a nice business. And one day he received a letter with a picture of a black hand on it. It was just an imprint of a hand. And it said, "Mr. Cangelosi, you will give us $10,000 or your youngest son will be killed." And my grandfather said, "Not me. I'm not paying any money." He refused to pay. Well, actually, I found out from my dad, a young Italian boy who lived across the street was killed by mistake. They thought he was one of the Cangelosis. So at that time, we were not known as the Mafia. It was known as the Black Hand. And they used to use a picture of a black hand. And at that time, the only thing that they did was threaten wealthy Italians just to be able to get money, selling protection. That's one of the things that they were known for. In the quarter, nobody had air conditioning those days. Later, we had attic fans and window fans that tend to cool you off. But a lot of times I can remember on Royal Street, go and sit. I had a porch in the front. Go and sit. It was just so hot. Watch the streetcars go by to pass the night when you couldn't sleep. If you wanted air conditioning, for the first time, the only places that had air conditioning was the Sanger and the Lower State, 2 theaters on Canal Street that were air conditioned. And then the department stores put air conditioning in, so we'd all go to the department store to shop. And I can remember when you went to Canal Street shopping, I went with my mother, either the streetcar or my dad would drive us. All the women on Canal Street wore hats, veils, and gloves. And I can remember one day as a young boy being on Canal Street, a policeman stopped a young lady who had shorts on and sent her home and told her to go put some clothes on to come back to Canal Street. You got dressed to go shopping. It was a custom at that time. Maison Blanche, Holmes's, Gacio's, beautiful stores downtown. And I can remember one Easter with another Italian friend of mine getting dressed up for Easter, going to Mass, and then walking up to Canal Street with a white suit and a stiff straw hat for Easter Sunday. Everybody dressed up. You had such a good time dressing. Going out to eat, places still today, like Galatoire's and Antoine's, you couldn't spend more than $30 with wine and a great meal. And of course, the best foods in those days too, in New Orleans, was seafood. Nobody ate meat at a good restaurant. Some people did, but if you wanted meat, you went to a steakhouse. But with New Orleans, the seafood was just so superior. And of course, to go to a restaurant in those days, coat and tie. You didn't have a coat and tie, you didn't get in a restaurant. The only one that keeps that up today is Galatoire's. Still jackets are required at Galatoire's. But the quarter was unique, and it was friendly. My dad had a pharmacy here in the quarter. During Prohibition, not Prohibition, but the Depression, he had a store on Charters, Royal and St. Philip. And I can remember as a kid, there was a showcase in the front. Sitting in the showcase at Mardi Gras, watched the maskers parade up and down Royal Street. At his pharmacy, he built a crystal radio, before radios were really too popular. And I can remember people coming in the drugstore at night to listen to baseball games with this crystal radio. Most of his prescriptions that he sold, he compounded himself. Nobody compounds anything. He made his own eye drops. He rolled his own pills and cut them up. He made his own suppositories. Everything was made right there in the pharmacy in those days. The pharmacy did close with Prohibition, but later he came back. He worked in different pharmacies and a hospital pharmacy for a while. But later he came back and bought a pharmacy on Charters and Domain, just 2 blocks from here, a Desport Pharmacy. That pharmacy actually opened in 1861. And I still have the first 2 prescriptions written in 1861. They were both for Confederate soldiers. And the medication was an arsenical, which is at the time was a treatment for syphilis. So in 1861, the number 1 and number 2 prescriptions are still in existence. When he bought it, we found all kind of old medications. I have a bottle at home of, for a while we used to use terpene hydrate and codeine. It's a good cough syrup, but it stopped you from coughing. Well, I found a bottle of terpene hydrate and heroin, when heroin was still illegal, because it stopped the cough. All kind of medications proven to cure cancer. So, all of these were sold over the counter. My dad's pharmacy was open 7 days a week. Usually opened at 9 in the morning and closed at 9 at night. On Sunday, he was only there for a half day. But a soda fountain and inside the pharmacy, and I can remember as a teenager, used to work the soda fountains, and people would come to get ice cream sodas and ice cream at the soda fountain. So it was part of growing up, part of living, and just having a good time in the city of New Orleans. I was always interested in medicine. I decided I wanted to become a physician. I went to St. Aloysius, and after I finished Aloysius, I went to Loyola University here up in St. Charles for a pre-med. After my pre-med, I went to LSU Medical School, which is here in New Orleans, next to Charity Hospital. At that time, Charity Hospital was the 2nd largest hospital in the United States. It had been built by Huey Long in the 1930s. It was a beautiful building. Actually, there were 3,000 beds at Charity Hospital. As a medical student there at Charity Hospital, I still lived in a quarter when I went to medical school. Actually, before medical school, when I went to Loyola, I lived in a quarter. I lived on Royal Street. When I used to go to school at Loyola, I would take the Desire streetcar to Canal Street, get off, catch the St. Charles streetcar, ride the St. Charles streetcar 63 blocks up to Loyola, do all my homework on the streetcar. And that was all for 7 cents. I'd come back home on the streetcar. Then at medical school, when I went to medical school, we did some work at Charity Hospital. But Charity Hospital at that time was the largest obstetrical service in the world. There were like 20,000 babies a month born at Charity Hospital. It was a huge obstetrical service. In fact, it was such a big hospital that people used to come, especially interns and residents for training, who would come to Charity Hospital from all over the country because of the variety of medicine and the training that you got here at Charity Hospital. Charity Hospital is closed now, but up the street we have a new medical complex, which is almost as big, and it's a beautiful place. And after I finished medical school, I went to stay at Charity Hospital, went to Hotel Dieu, which is Hotel Dieu is a hospital run by the Daughters of Charity, same as a Hotel Dieu in Paris. I interned there for a year and then went back to Charity for residency, 3-year residency in ophthalmology. Learned all my surgery there, finished there, and opened a practice, which was then a suburb of New Orleans, the area called Gentilly. And I've been in practice out there ever since. But no matter who you are or where you go in New Orleans is like a small hometown. Everybody knows everybody if they're not related to one another. So it's a good family, close culture that you just can't find anywhere else in the world. My grandfather, the Greco, when he did fairly well, he would buy different little pieces of property, a lot of them in the quarter or surrounding the quarter, and he'd put his families there. My grandfather, the Cangelosi, his 5 boys, he had a big produce place, but none of his boys wanted to go in the produce business. But my dad was the only one who went to college and became a pharmacist. He went to Loyola for pharmacy school and stayed here in the city. But growing up either 934 Royal Street with the Cangelosi grandparents, 1312 Royal Street with the Greco grandparents, and my house with my mother and dad was in the 1200 block of Royal Street, right in between. And just close-knit family, and it seemed like you were related to everybody in the city of New Orleans. Great experiences and experiences that you never ever forget, that you cherish. First time I really ever heard anything about any discrimination, when I was at Loyola, I started Loyola, I was 16, and I wanted to get in the fraternity. I got in this Jesuit fraternity, Alpha Delta Gamma. And pledge night, we're waiting and waiting to find out whether we got in or not, whether you got blackballed. And we were waiting, usually 9, 10 o'clock you found out. I was waiting until 12 o'clock, and finally I heard the news that I did get in the fraternity. But I found out that the big problem was, at the time, I was the first Italian ever to get in a fraternity at Loyola, a Catholic college. So there's a certain amount of discrimination. And New Orleans, Sicilians, Italians, you didn't get in the New Orleans Country Club. You wanted to belong to the country club, you went into the Metairie Country Club, which accepted Italians. When I was growing up, I had a little boat. I tried to get in the Southern Yacht Club and wasn't accepted. And I was told, well, I think you probably need a boat. I bought a nice sailboat, did a lot of sailing, tried to get in the Southern Yacht Club. Never did hear anything, and found out there are no Sicilians in the Southern Yacht Club. So there's discrimination, but it's just kind of subtle in the city of New Orleans. And when I was growing up, didn't even realize it. I found out later. And once I found out, they have their organizations, that's fine for them, and I'm not interested in being part of it. It didn't bother me, and I didn't find out till late that such discrimination did exist. Grandparents, Joseph Cangelosi, when he came, I don't know why, I think things were pretty tough in that time. Wasn't much to do in the town of Cheffelou, and they were coming to New Orleans because of the port of embarkation. So he came, bought this house on Royal Street, which General Beauregard lived in. It was a 3-story house, I think I mentioned. Paid $2,000 for it at the time, great big courtyard, and started this wholesale produce. He loved the city. He wanted to be part of this city. His sons grew up here, his daughters. There were actually 10 children. And the other grandparent, the Greco came from the same town. And we all used to get together. But when they came over, it was to start a new life and to have new friends, new place to live. And as the Italians came in, they gradually made a little bit of money, sent their children to college, and get their degrees. My grandfather spoke Italian and spoke very good English, both grandparents. As the children grew up, the children were able to learn Italian. However, they were not allowed to speak Italian. Grandparents, both grandparents said, "You are in America, you speak English," which is bad in a way because I didn't learn to speak Italian because it was not polite to do that because you were in America now. You had to speak English. My parents could speak Italian, but they never did speak it at home. They always spoke English. I can understand a few words and I can get by, but I can't speak. I guess this is probably the only country. Every other country in the world, English is a second language, but here, English is English and nothing else. So that's one bad thing, that we didn't have a second language. Cangelosi's had a 50th wedding anniversary now on 34 Royal Street. Their children had 5 boys, 5 girls. They had a reenactment of the wedding. There were the bridesmaids and the grooms at the wedding, and great big family. And it's the culture of a family meant so much to the Italians being here. And that's the one thing that always has stood out especially with the Sicilians, is family. The family was the most important thing. Families did everything together, and families took care of one another. You got in a problem, everybody else in the family helped out. So, in fact, a couple of weeks from now, on the Greco side of my family, my mother's grandparents, one of the 4th generation, is having a reunion to have all the Grecos get together. So I'm going to get to see some cousins I've never ever seen before. We're going to have a little get together at one of the restaurants here in New Orleans. And there was no segregation. There had black families living right down the block. In fact, in my Cangelosi, there was a gal, her name was Callie, a black gal, used to work for my grandmother, help cook and help clean the house. She lived across the street. So she just walked across the street to come help out. But in those days, there were no segregation. There were many blacks living in the French Quarter. So no segregation. And I used to shine shoes with a little black boy for a nickel on Bourbon Street, when Bourbon Street was a little different in those days.
How was it different?
And then the buildings in the quarter. You know, when I grew up, a lot of the buildings were empty, and they were still as they are today, but in need of restoration. And everything was family. Today, the problem today with the quarter, no more families. You know, a lot of houses, even cottages that were individual family homes, have now been broken up into condos. And condos, the people who own the condos don't live here, so they rent them out. So there's not much home life in the French Quarter. That's the bad thing about the quarter today. But when I grew up, the whole quarter were families, and not just the lower part of the quarter, but as far up as you could go, even up on Bourbon Street. Hal Boggs's wife lived on Bourbon Street. Beautiful home. The house is still there. There's physicians there now, but families all through the quarter. And the majority of those families, way back, were Italian. When I was living on 1400 block of Royal, my dad had a friend lived across the street. Name was Briccata. I think Anthony Briccata. He had went by the name of Jimmy Moran. Jimmy Moran was a bodyguard for Huey Long. And he later opened up a Moran's restaurant, where La Louisiana is in the quarter. And his wife did great Italian cooking. She used to make great meatballs and gravy. And his little gimmick, Jimmy, it was Diamond Jim Moran. He loved diamonds. He had diamonds on his fingers. He had diamonds in his ear. He even had a diamond in his zipper in his pants. So he used to advertise that one day somebody would get a diamond in their meatballs. And he had a camp in Little Woods, which is on Lake Pontchartrain, when he was bodyguard for Huey Long. He had slot machines. And I can remember he invited my dad and the whole family, went to his house. And when we got to the house, he gave everybody a bag, old brown bag, and the bag was full with silver dollars. So you can play the slot machines. Well, I still have a silver dollar minted in New Orleans at the mint right here, and it's 1884, so this is right after the Civil War. And this was in that bag, so out of my silver dollars, I still keep this silver dollar. And it's a great thing about it, it's just like it's brand new. Sterling silver, of course, minted at the New Orleans Mint in 1884. It was 20 years after the Civil War. But Jimmy Moran was with Huey Long when he was shot. Okay? He was one of the bodyguards. But he had one of the great restaurants. A lot of the real Italian restaurants in New Orleans, in fact, one just died, Tony Angelo. He was from Sicily. He had two sisters. He had a restaurant that used to be in Gentilly, then he moved out to Lakeview. His sisters did all the cooking. Everybody had meatballs and gravy. When I was a kid, I did a little work delivering things in a quarter, and one day I'm coming down Charter Street and I had a little blue plate special, one of the little greasy spoons, and I went in and had a 50-cent lunch. And it was so good. I went home and told my wife a great lunch I had for 50 cents. And she said, "What was it?" I said, "I don't know, but something called tripe." And she said, "Do you know what tripe is?" I said, "No." She said, "It's the stomach of a cow." I said, "Well, yeah, it was good." One of my favorite foods today is tripe stew. With Tony Angelo's restaurant, he had all Italian foods. His sister did all the cooking. He always had two things, especially for the Italian. It was never on the menu, but he always had them. One was tripe stew with potatoes and red gravy. And during the Depression, with the Italian families there, tripe was cheap, so you had tripe. The other thing was fresh pig feet gravy. He made a red gravy for pasta with fresh pig feet. He'd cook the pig feet, boil it, and then put it in the gravy. Sweetest gravy because of the pork that you ever had. You just eat the knuckles. So anytime I went there, I always got my fresh pig feet. At home, growing up in New Orleans, Tuesday was always red beans and rice. You know, not everybody, but Italian families too. One day of the week, you always got meatballs and spaghetti. Another day, great New Orleans food was pain veal. And I don't know about today, but back those days, New Orleans sold more veal per capita than any other city in the United States. New Orleans was a big veal town. It was good, and it wasn't as expensive as beef, so everybody had veal. And of course, in the summertime, everybody had crawfish. So, but with the Italians at home, a lot of Italians had things like the tripe stew and the pig feet, because, I mean, especially during the Depression, and I grew up in the 30s, it was good food, and it was delicious food. And so many of the restaurants still today have great New Orleans food. The food is not just French or Spanish, but it's a mixture of the African, the French, the Spanish, and the Italian. That's what makes New Orleans cuisine so good. And the Sicilian, especially Sicilian, because Northern Italian, there's no red gravies at all. So really the red gravies from Naples on down, and especially in Sicily. And I didn't make it to Sicily, to Cefalù, until just 2 years ago. And one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. I wish I'd been able to go a lot sooner, but I thought Sicily was just positively beautiful, more beautiful than a lot of Italy. Great things in Italy, but really impressed with Sicily. And I went to one little town. My son, architect, told me, when you go to Sicily, he said, go see the Grecian ruins. I said, in Sicily? He says, oh yeah. He said, there are more Grecian ruins in Sicily than they have in Greece, because all the Greeks vacationed in Sicily, and they were big towns. And there were 3 towns in the southern part of Sicily. And one, I found out, a lot of the temples are still standing. At the time the Greeks were there, it was the 3rd largest city in the world. So Sicily has played a large part in Europe. And their foods, especially in New Orleans, the Sicilian foods, is one of the reasons New Orleans cooking is so great, plays a great part of it. And we had that at home. And Mr. Angelo, one day of the week, probably on a Monday after Big Sunday, they had these wooden boards. You'd pick up the boards and clean them, and he's hosing down. The ice cream parlor was all tile floors, so they'd wash everything down, and I'd see him in a big old broomstick mixing all the gelatos. And everybody went to Bricata's on a Sunday. Great Italian delicacy. And his cannolis, which they're still available because his grandsons are doing it now. But yeah, I grew up loving all that stuff. When Mother Cabrini first came here, she founded the Cabrini Nursery on Esplanade, St. Mary's Italian School, and the day nursery on Ursuline in Bourbon. My grandfather gave her first horse and buggy when she came to town, and she used that to go around begging from the Italians who had some money so she can take care of the orphans and the poor. And I can remember as a child on the day nursery, there was a Cabrini day nursery on right off of Bourbon Street, I think St. Philip. They had these little beds of bunks that folded up against the wall. You'd pull them down, and they were about 3 feet long. I can remember sleeping on those little bunks because it was a day nursery, and you'd bring your children there if you had some place to go, and the nuns would take care of the children. All right here in the quarter. Wife was a blind date. She was at Charity Hospital. She was working in the OB floor, and I was a medical student. We met and fell in love and got married, and after we were married, I lived with my dad for a while. Married when I was in medical school. And I had 3 boys and 1 girl. My oldest son, Robbie, is the architect, and the other 2 sons are ophthalmologists that work with me. One is in the North Shore now. I have a daughter who lives in Lafayette. So when I was going to Loyola, there was a house on Palmer Avenue that I fell in love with. My wife lived up on Broadway. She fell in love with the same house before we knew one another. So when we decided to get married, we were going to build a house. We wanted to build that house. So I had pictures of it, and Leon Impostata, who was an architect from the quarter, built the house, and he said, okay, I'm going to build your house. He said, but what I'm using for a model of your house is the Beauregard house, Charter Street. And the portico that you have here, and instead of the round columns, I have brick columns. The mock portico share is a drive. Instead of a walk, it's a drive. But it's the same lentils. He used this as a model from it. So, I still can't get out of the quarter. But that's my remembrance of being here in the quarter. And like I say, even my architect was Sicilian. He lived on St. Philip Street down the quarter. It was a big family, Impostata family. In fact, they now have a couple of restaurants, Impostata's here and on the North Shore. When I grew up for Mardi Gras, I'd walk up Bourbon Street, go on Canal Street. Can't do that anymore. You know, and Mardi Gras, the days I grew up, were all families. Now it's changed. It's not. Families go up on St. Charles Avenue now because of Bourbon Street and the liquor and everything. It's kind of changed. And I still enjoy the quarter because of the buildings. After I was married and moved out to the lakefront, my wife and I used to come every Wednesday would come. I was off on Wednesday. Every Wednesday would come to the quarter and eat at either the Royal Orleans or Antoine's and walk the quarter, go to all the different shops on Wall Street. You can still do that, but even when I did it with my wife, we still had a lot of families there. And you kind of miss that. It's more touristy now. I still enjoy it. There's no place like the quarter as far as the architecture, the food, and the music. But I think the one thing that's missing is the family life, all the families. I don't think we'll ever get that back because properties of the quarter have got so expensive that families can't afford it anymore.
What was your wife's background?
Her name was Nastasi. Was her father. Her mother was a Pater Nostra, so she was, and he was from Sicily also. And I think her mother was from Sicily, but not from the town of Cefalù. But they came here, same reason, I guess. All the other Italians came looking for a new life. And he had, when my wife was 2 years old, her mother died. She had one sister and two brothers. And then her father, with 4 children, was looking for another wife to raise the kids. And somebody, well, we know a nice Italian girl in Morgan City. And he married her and had 4 more children. So my grandfather had 4 children, my wife's siblings, and 4 siblings with the new mother. So they grew up together in Broadway. And so actually with my wife and all her siblings, they're all Sicilian. No, holidays, Easter and Christmas, were like really American. There was nothing special with the Italians or Sicilians in the quarter. For Christmas we had Santa Claus, and when my kids came along, my wife and I put all the toys together. And in those days we used to have electric trains, and always had electric trains. But that was all American. Easter was also the bunny and Easter eggs, but the big thing about Easter and Christmas was more so than the social part, was the church. Christmas, the birth of Christ, and Easter, the resurrection. So there were 2 big religious holidays, and that was the most important thing, was with the Sicilians. You always were at church and with the whole family. And for Easter Sunday, you're always dressed up. Still today, I wear seersucker, New Orleans seersucker suit for Easter, because seersucker is New Orleans in summertime. But that's not really Sicilian, but that's New Orleans. But the Sicilians picked up a lot of what was New Orleans. But I guess our city, being French and then Spanish, and then back to France and then American, going through all that, it had a lot to do with our culture. Such a rich continental history. Every Easter for the last couple of years, and I'm doing it again next year, I tried to get the Cangelosi family together. My wife's been dead about 5 years, and she always used to have one big dinner. And my kids have other things, so I always had Easter. And I forgot about it one year, and I got reminded. So I got the whole family, the Cangelosi family together, and we went to, Brennan's had just opened up on Wall Street. And we went to the Brennan's in the Queen's Room and we were 23, I think. Had a big dinner with the wine. It was great. The next year I wanted to go back and I called up and I was too late. They were all booked up. So I had been and I liked it. I called up the Napoleon House. Ralph Brennan owns the Napoleon House. And upstairs, they do catering. Upstairs is one of the most gorgeous dining rooms in the city of New Orleans. It's all cypress, positively beautiful. Great big room. I think it was 2 rooms. They opened up beautiful chandeliers, medallion, but all the woods upstairs are cypress and hardwood floors. So we were 23 for dinner, and I had been to a group, French Eating Society, and I duplicated what they had. The chef, Montero, had Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite foods. It was all his favorite foods. And the wines were his queen, who was Napoleon. Can't think of her name right now. But he had all her wines, and it was good. Everybody liked it so much, so they said, boy, if you ever want to go back there, Granddaddy, we went. So we went back again this year for Easter, and we had dinner there. We were 23. In fact, I liked it so much, I told, book me in for next year again. But that's New Orleans, you know. That's right, Napoleon House. It's just so New Orleans. The Italians have so much to do with the food in New Orleans. The Sicilian food, southern Italy, the food from Naples down, is our type of New Orleans Italian food. So, being Italian or Sicilian, and in fact, I used to think I was Italian. I didn't know what Sicilian was when I grew up. But being Sicilian and growing up in New Orleans, it just means so much. And the heritage is so good. We enjoy it and admire it and think that these grandparents came over here, probably couldn't even speak English at the time. But my grandfather came over on a boat with, I think, a brother of his. And he was 18 years old when he came over. And when he married his wife, he married at called St. Anthony's Church on Rampart Street, which is now Lady of Guadalupe. My grandmother was a D'Alfonso. She was 16 years old. He was 29. And they had 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls. When I was an altar boy here at St. Mary's, I'd go 6:30 Mass in the morning. I'd walk home just 2.5 blocks down the street, and I'd turn the corner from Governor Nichols into Royal Street. And there's one little Creole cottage. In the back, one of the little slave quarters, there's a Sicilian, name is, I think, was Napoli. He used to bake Italian twist bread. And I'd stop there after 6:30 Mass, and for a nickel, I'd buy a loaf of this hot Italian Swiss bread with butter and a cup of coffee. Great, great breakfast. But, and my grandfather on the grocery store in Barracks always had the muffalata bread or the Sicilian twist, all Sicilian breads. And they were baked right here in the quarter. And this was a little, he had his own oven, right, and buy a loaf of bread for a nickel, and just fantastic. Everything good, everything fresh. My mother died young, but I was very close to my mother. I can remember the thing that frightened me so much. I graduated from St. Mary's. I was valedictorian. And I'd written out my speech. And I'm up there giving my valedictorian address. And I look down in the audience, and there's my mother with my address in her hands to make sure I got it right. I almost got so flustered I didn't know what to say, but she wanted to make sure I got it right. She was a big, big help. I was really close. And then my dad had the drugstore, so he was always working. We didn't do much traveling, but I had aunts on the Cangelosi side. I had one aunt that lived in Houma, Louisiana. She had a son that went in World War II, because I was a Boy Scout in World War II. And I used to go there every summer and had great Italian food. And I'm close to cousins. My youngest brother was a lot younger than I, but I was pretty close to him. So we were pretty close. But my mother and my dad just meant so much to me. They really guided me in everything that I did and everywhere that I went. World War II, I was at St. Aloysius when Germany surrendered. I was in the Boy Scouts, and in the quarter we had a civilian defense. There were submarines in the Mississippi River, and worried about air raids. And my dad was a warden, an air raid warden, and I was a Boy Scout. And I remember at the house, we had this bucket with a pump, and when they had this air raid drills, I'd grab the bucket, fill it up with water, and go in the street with my dad, and people would come by, one's putting this drill on, and throw little incendiary bombs in the street, and I have to go out with my pump to put out these little incendiary bombs. It's just a practice, and we had blackouts, but no, so I was not in World War II. And then I went to medical school in the Korean War, but I was a physician and had children, so I didn't serve in the military.